Before the story begins, please let me know in the comments section which state or country you are watching this from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can continue to grow and present even more captivating stories. The sizzling aroma of sautéed garlic and onions, blended with the rich scent of roasting chicken, filled every corner of our small city apartment. That morning, just like hundreds of mornings before it, began with a joyful, bustling energy. My hands moved nimbly across the cutting board, chopping vegetables to a rhythm I had memorized by heart. In the corner of our cozy kitchen, Chloe, my only daughter who had just turned 5, sat at her little table. She wasn't playing with dolls or watching morning cartoons. With deep concentration, the crayons in her small hands danced across a sheet of paper, sketching something she proudly called her secret rainbow cupcake recipe just for me. This was our world, a tiny universe I had painstakingly built, founded on absolute love and the comforting smells of home cooking. 5 years ago, I, Rachel, arrived in this city with nothing but a shattered heart and a new life blossoming inside my womb. I used the severance pay from my old corporate job to rent this cramped walk-up apartment and buy the most basic commercial kitchen equipment. From there, I launched Rachel's Kitchen, a home-based catering business. At first, it was strictly word of mouth, providing prepped lunches for my neighbors and busy professionals in the building. Slowly but surely, thanks to sheer perseverance and my grandmother's heirloom recipes, the business blossomed. Today, I employed 2 part-time assistants and had a fully booked schedule catering for local corporate events and boutique parties. We weren't filthy rich, but we had more than enough. We were happy. It was a simple, tangible happiness, as warm and real as a batch of freshly baked cookies. As I was mixing batter for an afternoon pastry order, the apartment buzzer rang. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked over to open the door. The mailman offered a friendly smile as he handed over a stack of mail. Usually, it was just utility bills and a few glossy supermarket flyers. But today, slipped between the mundane envelopes, was a thick, cream-colored envelope that felt entirely different. It was heavy, made of premium cardstock, and my name was embossed on the front in stunning gold calligraphy. There was no return address, but the postmark indicated it came from my hometown on the East Coast, the very city I had fled 5 years ago. Carrying the stack inside, a prickle of curiosity began to tease my mind. Chloe, spotting the beautiful envelope, immediately ran over. "Mail for Mommy! It's so pretty!" she exclaimed. I smiled, brushing her soft hair out of her eyes, and carefully broke the wax seal, which bore the elegant initials M and R. Inside lay a wedding invitation, more lavish than anything I had ever held in my life. The paper was thick, with gilded edges. With a heart that suddenly began to race for no apparent reason, I read the names printed inside. "Joyfully invite you to celebrate the marriage of Madison and Ryan." The name Ryan made me freeze, like hearing an echo from a room that had been sealed shut for years. Of course, it's not my Ryan, I thought quickly. Ryan is a common enough name. Besides, the Ryan I knew could never afford to host a wedding this opulent. But the name above it, Madison, yanked every memory I had buried deep within my soul violently to the surface. Madison, my best friend. My soulmate through 4 years of college. My mind instantly flew back to those days. Madison and I were inseparable. We shared a cramped dorm room, split the last packet of instant ramen at the end of the month, laughed until our stomachs cramped, and cried on each other's shoulders. We shared the same dream, opening a little bakery and cafe after graduation. Madison was always the bolder, more ambitious one. She was the one who pushed me to enter the campus culinary bake-off, which finally gave me a shred of self-confidence. I remembered her as a vibrant, fiercely driven figure. Though, if I were honest, there was always a highly competitive edge to her that sometimes made me feel small. A side of her I always chose to ignore because I loved her like a sister. So why had we lost touch? My thoughts clouded as I tried to piece it together. Graduation was the turning point. I got a low-paying administrative job just to make ends meet. Then I met Ryan. I fell so deeply in love. We started a life together, a life defined by financial struggle. And then I got pregnant. That was when my entire world caved in. Ryan left me when I was at my most vulnerable. Amidst that chaotic heartbreak, I felt profound shame. Ashamed of myself, ashamed of my fate. I couldn't bear to face the pitying looks from anyone, especially Madison. So, I ran. I moved to this city, changed my phone number, and cut ties with everyone from my past. I just wanted to start a brand new chapter with my unborn child. Now, this invitation rested in my hands. A bridge to a past I had firmly boarded up. Part of me hesitated. Returning to that city meant tearing open old wounds. It meant walking down streets that held a million bitter memories. Yet, another part of me genuinely missed Madison. I wanted her to see me now. I was no longer poor, abandoned Rachel. I was a mother. I was a successful business owner. I had made it. I had survived. "Mommy, are we going to the party? Chloe wants to wear a pink dress," she whined softly, tugging at the hem of my shirt. Her sweet voice snapped me back to reality. I looked down at her hopeful, innocent face. Maybe it was time. Maybe it would be good for Chloe to see where her mother came from. Maybe it was finally time for me to make peace with my past, for the sake of our future. As I went to slide the invitation back into its envelope, a small slip of paper fluttered to the floor. It was a handwritten note, penned in Madison's distinct, slightly slanted, artistic handwriting. I picked it up and read, "Please come. I have a huge surprise for you. You absolutely have to see this." A faint smile touched my lips. A surprise? I imagined Madison had planned something special, perhaps a mini reunion with our old college friends tucked into the wedding festivities. The words felt warm, like an embrace from an old friend. My doubts vanished instantly. The decision was made. We were going. I grabbed my laptop and opened the Amtrak website to book our train tickets. As I selected our departure time, my mind was already racing, deciding which dress I would wear, and, of course, seeking out the most beautiful, poofy pink dress I could find for my little princess. I felt a glimmer of genuine warmth and excitement, an anticipation for a beautiful reunion. I was completely oblivious to the fact that I was stepping straight onto the stage of the most cruel, calculated betrayal imaginable. The rhythmic clacking of the train wheels against the tracks provided the soundtrack to our journey. We had secured window seats, and Chloe pressed her face against the glass, her eyes sparkling with awe as green fields and suburban neighborhoods sped past. The cool air from the AC vent brought with it a sense of fun adventure for my daughter. For me, however, it felt like the cold breath of the past. Every mile we traveled felt like I was being pulled closer to a giant magnet I had long tried to escape. "Mommy, tell me the story about Aunt Madison again," Chloe pleaded, finally pulling her eyes away from the window. Her question was like a key turning the lock of an old, dusty chest of memories. I smiled and began to weave the tale. I painted Madison as a hero in my stories. I told Chloe about how Aunt Madison always stood up for me if anyone gave me a hard time, how she brought me chicken noodle soup when I was sick in our dorm, and how we once foolishly stayed awake all night on the roof of the humanities building just to watch a meteor shower. I shared all the good things, the laughter, and the joy. I deliberately cherry-picked the brightest, most sparkling fragments of my memories, assembling them into a perfect mosaic of friendship for my daughter's little ears. I wanted Chloe to know that before our world consisted of just the two of us, her mother once had a best friend who meant everything to her. But the deeper I dug into those college memories, the harder it became to avoid the shadow of another figure. A figure whose name I had never once uttered in Chloe's presence, Ryan, her biological father. Even as I recounted the story of a campus indie music festival where Madison and I volunteered, my memory automatically played the scene of my first meeting with Ryan backstage. He was the lead guitarist for a local indie band performing that night. I vividly remembered his calm, soulful eyes, his slightly awkward smile, and his fingers dancing so skillfully across the guitar strings. That night, amidst the roaring cheers of the crowd, he sang a song while staring directly at me, and I fell in love. I remembered our first date. We were dead broke, so we just bought 2 cheap hot dogs from a street cart and sat on a bench in the city park until late at night. We talked about everything, about his dream of becoming a famous musician, about my dream of owning a cafe. Back then, everything felt possible. His love felt like the fuel that made me believe I could conquer the world. We were 2 kids dreaming of a bright future, despite the harsh realities of life. But the time machine in my head kept spinning uncontrollably, dragging me into the darker times. After graduation, we rented a tiny, run-down apartment and began to feel the crushing weight of reality. Ryan struggled to find a steady job. He took on random gig work, but his spirit slowly extinguished. The music that was once his sanctuary became the source of his bitter frustration. The guitar he used to play for me was now often left gathering dust in the corner of the bedroom. His optimism was eroded by constant rejection and a pile of past-due bills. His complaints became the daily background music of our lives. "If only we had more money," or "life just isn't fair," became the phrases I heard most often. Petty arguments sparked frequently, usually ignited by trivial things, but the root cause was always the despair of poverty. Then came the night that changed absolutely everything. A night that felt so freezing cold, even in the middle of summer. I remembered it perfectly. I had just returned from the clinic after confirming the suspicions I'd had for the last few weeks. With trembling hands and a heart pounding with hope, I showed him the positive pregnancy test. I imagined he would be shocked, but then pull me into a tight embrace, and the promise of our unborn child would become the new motivation we both desperately needed. But the reaction I received was light years away from my imagination. His face showed zero happiness. All I saw was pure, unadulterated panic. It was as if I had just handed him a subpoena to appear in court. Pregnant? His voice was barely a whisper. Now, Rachel? At a time like this? That night, our arguments reached a boiling point. His usually gentle voice turned sharp, cutting, and cruel. He accused me of being careless, of trapping him in a life that was already too hard. He yelled that a child would be a massive anchor that would drown us both, destroying whatever was left of his dreams. I could only cry in absolute silence, wrapping my arms around my still flat stomach, as if trying to shield my baby from the vicious words of her own father. The climax arrived when he delivered the death sentence to our relationship. Maybe we just aren't meant to be together. I'm going to find my own path in life, and you should find yours. He then roughly shoved a few pieces of clothing into his worn-out duffel bag. Without so much as a glance backward, he opened the door and walked out, swallowed by the darkness of the night, leaving me completely alone with my violent sobs, shattered dreams, and a fragile new life pulsing quietly inside me. Mommy is crying. Chloe's soft, warm hand on my cheek pulled me back from the abyss of my memories. I hadn't even realized tears were streaming down my face. I quickly wiped them away, forcing a bright smile. No, sweetie. Just a little dust from the AC blew into Mommy's eye. I hugged her tightly. So tightly. The warmth of her little body was the anchor that kept me from drowning in the freezing ocean of my past. Her embrace was a physical reminder that Ryan's decision to leave was actually the greatest thing that had ever happened to me, because it gave me the ferocious strength to build this new world. Our world. The intercom announcement snapped me to attention. Our train was arriving at the station. As we stepped off onto the platform, the air of my hometown felt simultaneously foreign and familiar. The hustle and bustle of the commuters, the smell of pretzels and coffee from the station kiosks, it all triggered a strange sensation within me. It was no longer a warm nostalgia, but rather a cold, creeping premonition sliding down my spine. I gripped Chloe's hand a little tighter. We walked out of the station and ordered a rideshare to the hotel I had booked. Throughout the ride, I stared at the buildings I used to know so well, feeling like a tourist in my own country. That uneasy feeling grew stronger, like the sky darkening just before a violent thunderstorm. I tried to convince myself it was just normal pre-reunion jitters, completely unaware that my instincts were dead right. I was walking directly into the eye of the hurricane. Upon arriving at the hotel, I felt a spark of genuine excitement. Our room wasn't huge, but it was pristine and cozy. With a wide window overlooking the city park, Chloe immediately leaped onto the plush bed with a joyful squeal. Seeing her so happy warmed my heart. For a brief moment, I could completely forget the anxiety I had felt on the train. We unpacked our suitcase, and I pulled out the 2 dresses I had prepared. One was an elegant, navy blue evening gown for myself. The design was simple, but the tailoring was flawless. It was a dress I had bought with my own hard-earned money. That dress symbolized who I was now, simple, strong, and fiercely independent. For Chloe, of course, I had a voluminous, fuchsia pink party dress, complete with a massive bow at the waist. She looked exactly like a little princess from a fairy tale when she put it on. As I touched up my makeup in the bathroom mirror, I stared intensely at my reflection. This was no longer the face of a naive, starry-eyed 20-something girl. There were faint fine lines at the corners of my eyes, the permanent tracks of countless sleepless nights and unnumbered tears. But the look in my eyes was entirely different now. Sharper. Calmer. I had sailed through the storm and remained standing tall. Tonight, I was going to reunite with my old best friend, not as poor Rachel, but as Rachel, the proud mother and owner of Rachel's Kitchen. That confidence fueled me. We arrived at the venue's grand lobby. The wedding was being held an hour later. I gasped. This wasn't just a wedding reception. It was a colossal, high society gala. Thousands of white roses and orchids adorned every corner, cascading down towering marble pillars. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a golden, ethereal glow that made the entire ballroom sparkle. The guests in attendance wore designer evening gowns and bespoke tuxedos, speaking in hushed, elegant tones while sipping champagne served by white-gloved waiters. For a split second, I felt entirely out of place. This world was universes away from my world, which smelled of chicken broth and pastry dough. A whisper from my past, a voice telling me I didn't belong here, briefly echoed in my ears. But I immediately swatted it away. I straightened my spine, took Chloe's hand, and walked inside with my head held high. I scanned the room, searching for Madison's familiar face, but she was nowhere to be found. Perhaps she was still in the bridal suite preparing for the grand entrance. We found our assigned table, a beautifully decorated round table situated quite close to the main aisle leading to the altar. I offered polite smiles to the other guests at our table but had no interest in making small talk. I was too busy absorbing the sheer luxury surrounding me, trying to guess what kind of incredibly wealthy, influential man had married my best friend. I was genuinely happy for Madison. She had always craved a life exactly like this. Shortly after, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly. The soft instrumental music faded, replaced by the booming voice of an MC announcing that the vow exchange was about to begin. The entire crowd fell silent. All attention shifted to a beautifully elevated dais at the front of the room, complete with an altar draped in pure white silk. My heart beat a little faster, a natural anticipation when witnessing the sacred milestone of a dear friend. The groom's entourage entered the room. I tried to catch a glimpse of his face, but from where he was standing at the altar, his back was turned to me. I could only see his broad shoulders, clad in an impeccably tailored ivory tuxedo that practically screamed old money. I couldn't see his face clearly, nor could I see Madison. She hadn't made her appearance yet. The atmosphere grew hushed and solemn. The officiant began to speak. I smiled softly. My mind involuntarily drifted to my own daydreams from the past. I had once imagined a day like this with Ryan. Not a gala this magnificent, of course. Just a simple ceremony in the small chapel near my parents' house, witnessed by our closest family. A dream that had been ripped to shreds before it could ever materialize. Then, the pivotal moment arrived. The traditional vows were about to be spoken. The officiant prompted the groom. The groom cleared his throat softly, taking a deep breath to utter the sacred words that would legally bind him for life. I, Ryan, take you, Madison. That voice, the deep baritone timbre that filled the silent ballroom, felt like it shattered the space-time continuum, violently striking my eardrums and stabbing directly into my chest. It wasn't just a voice, it was a key. A key that forcefully crowbarred open the darkest, most heavily chained door at the bottom of my soul. A room I had kept hermetically sealed for the last 5 years. His voice was a bit richer now. More authoritative, polished by time and undeniable success. But the intonation, the slight pause between his words, the exact, distinct way he pronounced his vowels, it was unmistakable. It was impossible for me to be wrong. It was the voice that used to whisper sweet nothings in my ear in the dark. The very same voice that had screamed the cruelest, most vicious words at me on our final night together. The voice of the father to the child currently sitting sweetly beside me. My blood felt like it froze in my veins. The polite smile on my face solidified, then cracked into a million pieces. Impossible. My brain screamed, desperately rejecting reality. This has to be a coincidence. People can have similar voices. This is just a sick, twisted, illogical coincidence. To be my lawfully wedded wife. As he finished his sentence in one breath, he lifted his head slightly and turned his profile toward the witnesses standing beside the altar. The light from the crystal chandelier hit the side of his face with agonizing clarity, and that was the exact moment my entire world collapsed. The sharp jawline I used to caress, the straight nose that I always used to playfully boop, the exact shape of his ears that I knew better than my own. It was Ryan. It was genuinely, truly Ryan. My Ryan, Chloe's father. My breath caught in my throat. Every sound around me, the thunderous applause of the guests, the officiant pronouncing them husband and wife, it all sounded like a muffled drone from an underwater dimension. My heart felt as though it was being violently crushed by an invisible giant hand. He was the groom, and he had just married my best friend. The roaring applause still echoed throughout the ballroom, but I was trapped in a deafeningly silent bubble of sheer shock. I sat rigidly in my chair. My eyes were glued to Ryan's figure on the stage. My brain was spinning wildly, trying to deny what I had just seen and heard, Ryan and Madison. The two names that had once been the twin pillars of my life were now united in a legal bond that felt like a deliberate, calculated conspiracy against my very existence. The invitation. The beautifully engraved Madison and Ryan. It suddenly felt like a vicious taunt. This wasn't a coincidence. This was real. A wave of intense nausea rose from my stomach to my throat. I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles turning stark white, fighting with everything I had to keep my body from collapsing. My gaze then shifted to my daughter, Chloe. With heartbreaking innocence, she was clapping her hands joyfully. A massive smile stretched across her face. Her eyes sparkled as she took in the glamorous festivities around her. She was happily celebrating the wedding of her own father. The father she thought was a literal star in the sky. The father who had abandoned her without ever laying eyes on her face. The bitter reality slammed into me like a tidal wave, making it physically hard to breathe. Then, a massive surge of pure anger and maternal protective instinct boiled up, completely overriding the shock and heartbreak. I had to protect Chloe. I had to get her far away from this sickening charade. But how? Fleeing now would only draw a massive scene. Right at that moment, the MC's booming voice announced the grand entrance of the bride to join her legal husband for the reception. The towering, majestic mahogany doors of the ballroom slowly swung open. There stood Madison. She looked like a literal angel. She was wrapped in an ivory designer wedding gown encrusted with thousands of Swarovski crystals. Her cathedral-length veil swept across the marble floor. She was smiling the radiant, blissful smile that every bride is supposed to possess. As she began her slow, dramatic walk down the red carpet, her gaze swept across the standing guests welcoming her. Reflexively, I tried to bow my head, praying I could blend into the crowd and disappear. But it was too late. Our eyes locked. In the middle of an ocean of strangers, our gazes connected. For a fraction of a second, I saw surprise flash in her eyes. But it wasn't the surprise of unexpectedly seeing me. It was the thrill of realizing her master plan had worked perfectly. And then she did it. She did the one thing that confirmed my most wild, paranoid fears. Madison smiled at me. It was not the warm, welcoming smile of an old friend who hadn't seen me in years. No, it was a tight, freezing cold, and deeply triumphant smirk. A highly controlled smirk that clearly screamed, "I see you. I know you're here. Look at this, Rachel. This is the surprise. I won." The handwriting on that little note echoed in my mind again, now bearing a sickeningly different meaning. "I have a huge surprise for you. You absolutely have to see this." The surprise was never a sweet reunion. The surprise was this exhibition. This grandiose, multi-million-dollar stage she had intentionally built to flaunt her ultimate victory. To rub it in my face that she had stolen everything I had ever possessed and found valuable. A massive war raged inside me. A part of my soul screamed, begging me to grab Chloe, run out the door, and flee as far as possible from this living hell. Run and never look back. But the other side of me, the side forged in the fires of struggle over the last 5 years, vehemently refused to surrender. I looked at Ryan, who was now standing next to Madison. He held his new wife's hand, smiling for the swarm of photographers, but his smile was stiff, and his eyes looked entirely hollow. He hadn't spotted me yet. He looked like an expensive, well-dressed mannequin. Then I looked back at Madison, who stood with such arrogant, dripping confidence. Seeing that victorious smirk incinerated whatever remained of my grief, igniting it into a blazing, unquenchable inferno of rage. No, I am not running. I did not fight tooth and nail, completely alone, to raise my daughter and build an entire life from absolute zero, just to run away like a coward in the face of the ghosts of my past. I would not give her the sadistic satisfaction of seeing me break. I was going to face them. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing my racing heart to steady. I had to remain completely composed for Chloe's sake. I smoothed down the fabric of my dress and forced the most neutral, impenetrable expression I could muster onto my face. I constructed a titanium mask of calm to hide the Category 5 hurricane raging inside. I turned to my daughter. A soft, genuine smile graced my lips. "Chloe, sweetie, in just a minute, we are going to go up and say congratulations to Aunt Madison. And after that, Mommy promises we will eat the biggest chocolate ice cream sundae they have at this party," I said, my voice sounding miraculously more stable than I felt. Chloe cheered softly, her eyes instantly lighting up at the mention of ice cream. The grip of her tiny, warm hand in mine became the absolute center of my gravity. This little hand was the exact reason I survived, the reason I fought. And now, this same hand was going to give me the courage to walk right up to that stage. We were going to walk up there together, not as pathetic victims, but as living, breathing proof of the life they had so callously thrown in the trash. I didn't exactly know what I was going to say or do yet, but one thing was absolutely certain. I was not going to let them write the ending to my story. Tonight, I was taking the pen back. The music transitioned to a lively, upbeat love song, and the MC, with a polished, professional smile, invited the guests to form a receiving line to come up to the dais and personally congratulate the newlyweds. This was the moment. A fine tremor ran down my arms, but I balled my free hand into a fist until my knuckles turned white, transmuting every ounce of fear into pure, distilled power. I rose from my chair. It was a simple, physical movement that felt heavier than anything I had ever done. It felt like I was physically lifting the crushing weight of my past off my shoulders. I straightened Chloe's pink dress and gave her the most reassuring smile I could fake. "Come on, sweetie. Time to go shake hands with Aunt Madison and Uncle Ryan," I whispered, intentionally saying Ryan's name out loud for the very first time, testing my own fortitude. Chloe nodded obediently. The walk from our table to the steps of the dais felt like the longest trek of my entire life. It felt like walking barefoot across a hidden bed of nails. Every single step was a conscious, deliberate effort to stay upright, to not sway or stumble. The ballroom, which had seemed so magnificent earlier, now felt suffocating. It was packed with laughter and joyous chatter that sounded like alien buzzing in my ears. I became hyper-aware of everything around me: the glitter of the female guests' diamonds, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the overpowering, sickeningly sweet mixture of expensive perfumes and lilies. A few guests in the line smiled warmly at us. Their attention was entirely captivated by Chloe. "Oh, your daughter is absolutely stunning. So adorable," praised an older woman draped in an expensive silk shawl standing right in front of us. I could only manage a stiff smile and a brief nod. The compliment felt like an invisible dagger. They were praising the beauty of a child whose father was currently standing on that stage, completely prepared to deny her very existence. The irony was so thick, so suffocating, it made it hard to draw breath. I could only squeeze Chloe's hand tighter, as if channeling every last drop of my strength into her, when, in reality, she was the sole source of my strength right now. The line inched forward agonizingly slowly, giving me ample time to observe the two figures sitting on their velvet thrones. Madison was the absolute picture-perfect bride. She laughed gracefully, shaking hands with guests with well-rehearsed elegance, radiating a highly convincing aura of marital bliss. She looked like a newly crowned queen, savoring every microsecond of her victory parade. She looked so comfortable, so immensely powerful on her theatrical stage. Conversely, Ryan looked like a hostage. The smile plastered on his face never once reached his eyes. His eyes darted around nervously, glancing left and right as if desperately searching for an emergency exit, or perhaps anticipating a natural disaster. He shook hands like an animatronic robot. His movements and responses were entirely mechanical. I could see him so clearly now. He wasn't some brilliantly evil, cunning mastermind. He was just a weak man, a coward who took the easy way out because he was terrified of the struggle. He had traded true love, moral responsibility, and the privilege of fatherhood for this gilded, golden cage. And now, he was realizing with sheer, paralyzing terror that the door to the cage had been firmly locked from the outside. We were only a few people away from the couple. Ryan was looking the other way, briefly chatting with an older gentleman in a tuxedo. He hadn't seen us yet. But Madison, she knew exactly where we were. I could literally feel her gaze. Even without looking directly at her, I could feel the sharp, piercing stare of an apex predator watching its prey step into the trap. She wasn't anxious. Quite the opposite, she was fiercely anticipating this exact moment. She wanted this confrontation to happen right at the foot of her throne. This gala wasn't a celebration of love. It was a grandiose stage for an execution, and my utter humiliation was intended to be the main entertainment. Finally, it was our turn. I helped Chloe step up the two small carpeted stairs onto the dais. The air up here felt drastically different. Thicker, heavier, suffocatingly laden with history and unspoken treachery. The scent of Madison's signature perfume was so cloying it made my stomach churn. For a fleeting second, my courage severely wavered. The primal instinct to turn around and sprint away screamed at top volume inside my head. But then, I felt a tiny tug on my hand. Chloe. She looked up at me, her large, clear eyes brimming with absolute, unconditional trust. That tiny tug, that innocent gaze, it was the anchor that held me fast. I took a deep, ragged breath, scraping together every last molecule of strength in my soul. I stepped up and stood directly in front of them. First, I shook hands with both sets of parents standing to the side. I simply muttered a polite, "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs.," before sidestepping. Then, I stood dead center in front of Madison. The beautiful string quartet playing in the background seemed to instantly vanish, swallowed by the deafening silence that erupted between us. It felt as if the entire universe had shrunk down to just this spot. There was only me, Madison, Ryan, and an innocent child standing right in the middle of it all. Ryan still had his back partially turned, finishing up his chat. Madison's smile widened as sharp as a straight razor and as cold as liquid nitrogen. The main event was about to begin. I forced my lips to stretch into something that vaguely resembled a smile. When I finally spoke, my voice came out as a low, freezing whisper, just loud enough for Madison's ears only. "Congratulations, Madison." Saying her name felt like swallowing crushed glass. The phrase was no longer a well wish. It was a formal declaration of war. Madison's eyes gleamed with a vicious, cruel triumph. She leaned forward, extending her arms as if she were going to pull me into a warm best friend hug. But as her face brushed past my ear, she hissed in a mocking, venomous whisper, "Thanks for coming, Rach. I knew you wouldn't have the guts to miss my big day. So, how's the surprise? Spectacular, isn't it?" The sugary, sweet, entirely toxic tone of her voice was the ultimate, final confirmation. None of this was a twisted accident of fate. It was a meticulously crafted masterpiece of betrayal. Right at that second, Ryan finished his conversation and turned around. His gaze, automatically shifting to greet the next guest in line, landed first on the tiny figure of Chloe. Instantly, his entire body went rigid. The polite, formal smile that had been glued to his face vanished completely, replaced by an expression of naked, unadulterated horror. His eyes locked onto Chloe's face, a miniature, undeniable carbon copy of his own, and then slowly dragged upward to the woman gripping the child's hand. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a fresh corpse. Rachel. A name slipped past his lips without any sound, just the pathetic trembling of his mouth. The world around him visibly crumbled. His ultimate, darkest nightmare was currently wearing a navy blue dress and standing inches from his face. Before I could even react, before Ryan could even attempt to piece together the shattered fragments of his shock, Madison moved with lightning speed. She clamped her manicured hand aggressively around Ryan's bicep, a highly possessive gesture meant to assert total ownership. Completely ignoring her husband, who was currently frozen like a marble statue, she refocused all her sadistic attention on me. Her voice remained a hushed whisper, but the tone shifted into something sickeningly arrogant and boastful. It was as if she were bragging about winning a gold medal. "Want to know a little secret, Rach?" she hissed, clearly savoring every agonizing millisecond of my pain and Ryan's sheer panic. "I'm the one who told him to leave you." My heart literally stopped beating. I stared at her, entirely incapable of forming words. My brain violently refused to process the pure psychopathic evil of that sentence. Madison kept going. Her confession flowed smoothly, without a single stutter of remorse. 5 years ago, when he came to me crying, completely desperate and broke a few days after you dropped the pregnancy bomb on him, I gave him a very simple ultimatum. He could choose to stay with you, go back to your pathetic, poverty-stricken life, and be permanently chained to a pregnant girl who would do nothing but drag him down and kill his dreams. She paused dramatically, briefly glancing out at the immense wealth and luxury of the ballroom with her chin held high. Or, he could choose me. Choose a real future. I promised him all of this. My family's massive wealth, my father's corporate connections, a life of total luxury. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "You and that fetus are only going to be a permanent reminder of his failure." So, I told him to walk out, to forget that dark, depressing past. And look, she finished her monologue with a piercing, cynical sneer. I am a woman who always keeps her promises. The confession hit me like a Mack truck. I swayed emotionally, suffocating under a level of malice I couldn't have previously comprehended. But the devil in the designer wedding gown wasn't finished. Her icy, reptilian gaze drifted down to Chloe, who was looking up in deep confusion at the bizarre interaction between the adults. "And as for the kid," Madison said, employing a sickeningly light, dismissive tone, as if she were pointing out a minor wine stain on a tablecloth. "Oh, don't overthink it. Let's just call her a little souvenir from his dark ages." A tiny mistake that, thankfully, he doesn't have to pay for the rest of his life. A tiny mistake. Those 3 words were the detonator. The casual, flippant way she degraded the very existence of my daughter, my own flesh and blood, the sole reason I survived my darkest days, was the spark that ignited a dormant volcano of wrath inside my soul. My mask of composure shattered into dust. The pain, the shock, and the grief instantly evaporated, entirely consumed and replaced by a blazing, crystal-clear, white-hot fury. Enough. I was absolutely done playing the victim in their sick, twisted psychodrama. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a wireless microphone resting on a stand near the edge of the stage, temporarily abandoned by the MC. A wild, reckless, and intensely liberating idea began to crystallize in my mind. This stage was not going to be the platform for their grand victory. Tonight, I was going to transform it into my absolute court of justice. Madison's words, "a tiny mistake," kept looping in my ears, incinerating the very last shreds of my patience. The rage I felt wasn't a blind, chaotic heat. It was a freezing, hyper-focused fury that granted me absolute clarity of purpose. This was no longer about my broken heart. This was about defending the honor, humanity, and right to exist of my child. My eyes locked onto the microphone standing elegantly on its base. That object was no longer just an audio device. Tonight, it was going to be my weapon, my gavel of justice. In one swift, fluid, and incredibly deliberate motion, I let go of Chloe's hand. I stepped decisively past a now bewildered Madison and a still petrified Ryan, and I snatched the microphone right off its stand. A sharp, ear-piercing screech of feedback ripped through the speakers as I switched it on. The jarring noise violently tore through the elegant ambiance of the gala. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Every single movement in the massive ballroom ceased. Hundreds of pairs of eyes simultaneously snapped toward the stage. Toward me, an awkward, heavily confused silence blanketed the room. Every guest was silently asking the exact same question. Who is the woman in the navy dress, and why is she interrupting the reception? My heart was hammering so violently it felt like a trapped bird trying to batter its way out of my ribcage. But when my voice finally projected through the state-of-the-art sound system, it came out shockingly calm, steady, and incredibly powerful, echoing into the farthest corners of the ballroom. I sincerely apologize for interrupting the festivities and the joy of everyone in attendance tonight, I began. My tone was impeccably polite, yet laced with an undeniable, ironclad authority that physically forced the room to listen. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. Guests leaned in, whispering to each other, trying to guess my identity. I pivoted my body slightly, turning to face the newlyweds who were now staring at me with expressions of utter shock. The arrogant smirk of victory had entirely vanished from Madison's face, replaced by a mask of panicked disbelief and rising rage. Ryan looked as though his soul had just been forcibly evicted from his body. I just wanted to take this incredibly precious opportunity to offer my most sincere, most special congratulations to the happy couple. My eyes locked onto Madison's. I enunciated every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. Congratulations to my absolute best friend, Madison. I said, letting the phrase best friend hang in the air, dripping with toxic irony. Congratulations, because after 5 long years of waiting and scheming, you finally, successfully managed to get everything you ever wanted, by stealing it from someone else's life. A highly audible wave of genuine shock rolled through the guests. The gasps and whispers instantly escalated in volume, sounding like a hive of hornets that had just been kicked. The atmosphere, which had been so festive, instantly became wire-taut with anticipation. I then shifted my icy gaze to the groom, who was visibly trembling and sweating through his custom tuxedo. And, of course, an even more massive congratulations goes to the highly honorable groom, Ryan. I intentionally paused, letting the heavy silence crank the tension up to a near breaking point. I took a half-step backward, reached out, and grabbed Chloe's tiny hand again, gently guiding her to stand right by my side, dead center under the stage's spotlight. With my free hand gripping the microphone so hard my knuckles popped, I stared out at the sea of wealthy, stunned faces in front of me. My voice rang out again, louder and entirely unshakable. I dropped the bomb I had been carrying for 5 years. To the father of my little girl right here, Chloe, who is now 5 years old. A little girl that you tossed away like garbage, without a single shred of mercy, when she hadn't even taken her first breath of air. When she was still completely defenseless inside my womb. A collective, theatrical gasp erupted from every corner of the room. After that gasp, all that remained was silence. An absolute, crushing, deafening silence. Every single guest was frozen to the floor. Their eyes darted wildly from me, standing tall and resolute, to Chloe, looking around in innocent confusion, to Madison, whose face was now flushed crimson with demonic rage, and finally to Ryan, who looked entirely, totally destroyed. This magnificent, multi-million-dollar wedding had, in the blink of an eye, been transformed into a brutal public tribunal. And I was the lead prosecutor. The silence suffocating the ballroom felt physically heavy, thick with shock and unspoken, brutal judgment. Hundreds of pairs of eyes had transformed into a merciless jury, captivated by the raw, unscripted drama unfolding on the altar. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Madison and Ryan's parents sitting at the VIP tables. They were pale as sheets, bearing an unimaginable level of humiliation in front of their elite business colleagues and high society relatives. Madison glared at me with genuine murderous intent. Her flawless bridal makeup could no longer mask the pure, unadulterated hatred radiating from her face. As for Ryan, he was the literal personification of guilt. He didn't dare make eye contact with a single living soul. His gaze was glued to the tips of his highly polished Italian leather shoes, as if he were praying to God that the marble floor would split open and swallow him alive. Chloe, trapped right in the center of this silent hurricane, began to feel visibly uncomfortable. She didn't understand why the vibe of the party had suddenly turned so terrifyingly tense. She didn't know why hundreds of adults were staring at her. All she knew was that her mother looked incredibly sad, yet fiercely angry, and the man her mother was pointing at looked absolutely terrified. She tugged gently at the hem of my dress. "Mommy, why?" she whispered softly. But because the microphone in my hand was still live and highly sensitive, her tiny, innocent voice was broadcast over the speakers to every single guest in the room, adding a devastating, heartbreaking layer of tragedy to the spectacle. Hearing my daughter's voice, the raging fire in my heart slightly dimmed, instantly replaced by a tidal wave of profound sorrow. I looked down at her sweet face, and my expression instantly softened. This display wasn't meant to traumatize her, but she was now an inseparable part of this defining moment. Perhaps this was the one and only chance Chloe would ever have to look at her biological father. To know that he was, unfortunately, a real person. I crouched down to meet her eye level. I angled my body to shield her slightly from the piercing stares of the hundreds of strangers. "Sweetie, look at that man over there," I said, my voice soft but trembling with an emotion that every mother in that room undoubtedly felt in her own chest. I pointed straight at Ryan. That is your daddy." The word daddy tasted like ash in my mouth. It felt entirely alien, yet excruciatingly painful to say out loud to a living person. It was a title that, until now, had only existed in Chloe's bedtime fairy tales. Chloe looked at the broken, trembling man standing on the stage. She observed him with pure, untainted curiosity, like a child trying to solve a complicated puzzle. She tilted her head. Her brow furrowed deeply. She was clearly trying to reconcile the face of this terrified, sweating stranger with the image of the brave, heroic father I had always described to her. The father who had supposedly become the brightest star in the night sky. After thinking for a few seconds, she took one tiny step forward, right up to the microphone. She looked dead straight at Ryan, and with a voice so crystal clear and innocent, amplified by the speakers to reach every corner of the hall, she broke the silence with a single question. "Didn't you say Daddy became a star in the sky?" she asked. Her tone wasn't accusatory, it was just genuinely confused. She looked at me, then back out at the crowd, as if asking the whole world for an answer. "Mommy said Daddy was a good man who always watched over me from way up there." "Why is Daddy here? Did Daddy come down from heaven just to see me in my pink dress?" If my confession earlier was a bomb, then Chloe's innocent question was an emotional nuclear detonation that completely vaporized any remaining doubt or neutrality in that room. The simple, heartbreaking logic of a 5-year-old child had dissected the entire tragedy down to its bleeding core. That single question laid everything bare. 5 years of desperate lies a mother had been forced to invent to protect her child's heart. 5 years of longing from a little girl who missed a father she never knew. And the devastating heartbreak of realizing that the hero she had been mourning was actually alive, healthy, and standing right in front of her. The guests could no longer contain their emotions. Several women began to sob openly, pulling silk handkerchiefs from their designer clutches. The initial whispers of shock violently mutated into low growls of disgust and outright jeers directed squarely at Ryan and Madison. The flawless million-dollar fairy tale wedding they had orchestrated was now utterly annihilated. Not by my screaming or cursing, but by a profoundly innocent question from a little girl whose heart had just been broken. Chloe's question was the final verdict. Every single illustration, the finally shifted to us. These were elite business tycoons, socialites, and respected relatives. They had shown up to celebrate a sacred union, but now realized they had been conned into attending a sickening exhibition of cruelty and hypocrisy. "You absolute coward!" shouted a man in a tuxedo from the front row. "Do you have no conscience at all?" yelled a woman, her voice shaking with raw fury. An older woman sitting near the front, clearly a longtime friend of Ryan's family, stood up and pointed an accusatory finger directly at him. "I knew your father, Ryan. He is rolling in his grave watching you today. What kind of a man are you? Abandoning your own flesh and blood for a payout?" she shrieked. That shout was the sledgehammer that broke the dam. Other guests began to chime in, hurling insults and disgusted reprimands. Madison and Ryan's parents scrambled frantically to calm the crowd, apologizing profusely with chalk-white faces, but nobody was listening to them. The wedding they had bankrolled to elevate their social status had instantly morphed into a massive public graveyard for their family's reputation. A few guests began to turn on their heels and march out the doors with expressions of pure disgust, refusing to stay in that toxic room a second longer. Then, a small action triggered a massive avalanche of chaos. A younger man, furious, ripped the expensive boutonniere from his lapel and hurled it at the stage. That action opened the floodgates. A woman threw her crumpled linen napkin. Suddenly, items began flying toward the altar. They weren't dangerous objects, but they were deeply symbolic, humiliating projectiles. Empty champagne flutes, dinner rolls from the tables, centerpieces ripped from their vases, and several guests even tore their expensive wedding programs in half and threw them at the newlyweds. The altar, which had looked so regal and majestic 10 minutes ago, was now literally being trashed. Watching her perfect high society wedding disintegrate before her eyes, Madison finally lost her mind. She screamed hysterically. "Not at me, but at Ryan. This is all your fault. Why did you have to show up in my life 5 years ago? Why are you so pathetic and weak?" She shrieked like a banshee. Her priceless designer gown was now stained by splashes of wine and thrown drinks. Ryan just stood there, paralyzed like a statue, accepting every thrown flower and hurled insult with dead, hollow eyes. He was completely, irrevocably destroyed. It was as if his soul had abandoned his body, leaving behind nothing but the empty shell of a man who had literally lost everything in a single night. Amidst the roaring chaos, I knew my job here was done. Justice was being served, not by my hands, but by the very society they had tried to fool. There was absolutely nothing left for me to do. This was the stage of their total ruin, and I had no desire to be a spectator for another second. I crouched down, scooped Chloe up into my arms, and buried her face in the crook of my neck so she wouldn't have to witness this ugly, chaotic scene. "It's over, sweetie. We're going home now," I whispered, kissing the top of her head. With my head held exceptionally high, I turned my back on them and walked down the steps of the dais. The furious guests instinctively parted for me like the Red Sea. Many of them looked at me with eyes full of deep sympathy and respect. Several even nodded their heads at me in silent solidarity. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. From behind me, I could still hear Madison's hysterical screeching, the sounds of her parents sobbing, and the thunderous booing of the elite crowd. Those sounds were the soundtrack of a wedding, a reputation, and a life being smashed into a million irrecoverable pieces. Karma had arrived. It was swift, direct, and incredibly humiliating. And it felt absolutely, perfectly just. 1 year later, the morning sun was bright, and the rich aroma of freshly brewed espresso intertwined with the smell of buttery croissants, creating a wildly inviting, warm atmosphere. I stood in the middle of a spacious, gleaming, state-of-the-art commercial kitchen, one that was light years away from my old walk-up apartment. This was the kitchen of my very own brick-and-mortar business. The dream I had once shared with a trader, I had now manifested entirely on my own. On the beautiful, rustic wooden sign hanging above the front door, engraved in elegant lettering, was the name, Chloe's Cafe. My life had transformed completely. After that chaotic wedding night, the story of what happened spread like wildfire via word of mouth and eventually went viral on local social media and community forums. People were initially sympathetic and wildly curious, which led them to try my catering. Orders absolutely skyrocketed. Through sheer grueling hard work and a small business grant from a women's empowerment organization whose board had heard my story, I managed to open this cafe 6 months ago. People initially came for the drama and the gossip, but they came back, again and again, because the food was phenomenal and the vibe was unbeatable. I was finally financially secure, highly respected as a female entrepreneur in the city, and, most importantly, my heart was at total peace. Chloe, now 6 years old, was growing into a brilliant, deeply happy child. We had worked through the trauma of that night with the help of a fantastic child psychologist and boundless maternal love. To her, the man at the party was just the mean man who made mommy sad. Her world was vibrant and full of color, and she knew she was forever safe with me. As I was wiping down the espresso machine during a mid-morning lull, one of my baristas, Sarah, slid her iPad across the counter to me. "Rachel, you have to look at this." It was on the local business news site this morning. I picked up the tablet and read the headline. "Rocked by wedding scandal and defaulted loans. Local real estate empire files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy." Holding my breath, I read the article. It detailed, with brutal clarity, how the disastrous, highly publicized wedding scandal had been the catalyst for the downfall of Madison's family business. The public humiliation caused them to lose immense faith and trust with their biggest private equity investors, who, one by one, yanked their funding. Hammered by a toxic public image and a series of panicked, terrible financial decisions, their arrogant real estate kingdom had utterly collapsed. The article also touched upon the fate of the couple. Ryan and Madison had officially divorced before they even hit the 3-month mark. The suffocating public scrutiny and the unbearable humiliation had poisoned their marriage from the inside out. Madison, completely unable to cope with the shame of losing her elite status and all her luxury perks, had reportedly moved out of state, living in obscure exile somewhere in the Midwest. And Ryan. The final paragraph summarized his fate. He had been immediately fired from the cushy executive job at Madison's father's firm. He had tried to crawl back into the local music scene, but his name was absolute poison. He was heckled at open mics as the guy who threw away his pregnant girlfriend. The latest rumor was that he was working the graveyard shift as a cashier at a dingy gas station in the deep suburbs, living alone in a rented room, completely drowning in his own regret. I remembered that a few months ago, a mutual college friend had tried to reach out to me, saying Ryan was desperately begging to apologize. I had deleted the text without replying. I handed the iPad back to Sarah. There was no explosive, euphoric sense of victory in my chest. There was no lingering, vindictive malice. All I felt was a deep, quiet, and profound sense of closure. Their story was over. They were no longer characters in my universe. Their tragic fates were now nothing more than a tiny footnote in a book where I had already started writing an entirely new volume. I walked out from behind the counter and approached the massive front window of my cafe. In the small, fenced-in patio garden I had built on the side of the building, I saw Chloe swinging on the wooden swing set. Her bright, infectious laughter echoed all the way inside. That sound? The pure, unburdened laughter of my daughter. That was my true victory. That was the sweetest, most absolute revenge I could ever ask for. I pushed the front door open and walked out to join her. Giving her swing a gentle push, I laughed right alongside her under the warm morning sun. We hadn't just survived the storm. We had built our own paradise, and it was more than enough. 5 years have passed since the night that changed everything. 5 years is plenty of time to heal old wounds, rebuild a life from scratch, and grind the bitter rubble of the past into the concrete foundation of a rock-solid future. Today, Chloe's Cafe is celebrating its 5th anniversary. The place I had started with nothing but reckless desperation and the last fumes of my courage had blossomed into one of the most beloved brunch spots in the city. We had recently expanded into a larger, 2-story historic building, complete with a massive outdoor botanical patio that was packed with families every weekend. The exposed brick walls of the cafe were decorated with cheerful watercolor paintings done by Chloe, alongside pieces by local artists who had supported us from day one. The scent of freshly roasted Ethiopian coffee beans mingling with the aroma of hot butter croissants pulling out of the commercial ovens created a symphony of smells I looked forward to every single morning. I, Rachel, am no longer the same woman. I cut my hair into a sharp, practical bob. There are a few strands of silver framing my temples now, badges of wisdom that I paid an incredibly high price to earn. I now manage a staff of 15 incredible employees whom I treat like my own family. I no longer walk through life with the hypervigilance of a victim. I walk with the grounded, unshakable confidence of a CEO, a survivor, and a mother. My daughter Chloe is now 10 years old. She is growing into a brilliant, fiercely empathetic young girl with a wicked sense of humor. She is the sun around which my entire solar system orbits. Late that afternoon, in the midst of the bustling anniversary party we threw for our loyal regulars, Chloe was helping me pass out slices of a massive rainbow funfetti cake. She was doing it with a hilarious, highly professional customer service smile, acting as if she were the actual general manager of the establishment. Watching her joke around with the neighborhood kids on the patio, my heart swelled with a gratitude so immense it actually made my chest ache. This was my treasure. This was my triumph. Later that night, after the closed sign was flipped and the staff had all gone home, it was just the two of us. We sat on one of the plush velvet sofas tucked in the back corner of the dimly lit cafe, eating the leftover cake and drinking hot cocoa. This quiet, after-hours ambiance often triggered our most profound, meaningful conversations. "Mom," Chloe called out softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Earlier, Mr. Higgins from the bookstore across the street told me you were the toughest woman in the world because you built all of this completely by yourself." I smiled, reaching over to ruffle her hair. "Mom wasn't by herself. I always had you." She went quiet for a moment, slowly stirring her hot chocolate with a spoon. "Yeah, but he meant without a dad." My heart did its usual slight flutter, just as it always did when this topic surfaced. But I had long ago learned not to dodge it. Over the years, guided by the advice of her therapist, I had slowly told her the truthful version of our history, adapted appropriately for her age. She knew her father was alive. She vaguely understood what had happened at that wedding party, even if her own memories of the night were blurry. "Mom," she continued, this time with a much more serious look in her eyes, the look of a child who is beginning to grasp the painful complexities of the adult world. "Back then, did you ever really, truly love him?" I took a deep, steadying breath, looking into the eyes of a daughter who was now seeking the raw truth, not a sanitized fairy tale. "I did, sweetie." "Very much," I answered with total honesty. "A long time ago, before I knew you were coming, before the world felt so heavy and scary, he was a completely different person back then. He was a guy who could make me laugh until my ribs hurt just by telling a stupid joke. He was a guy who had massive dreams and his eyes would light up whenever he talked about playing his guitar." I paused, choosing my next words with extreme care. Mom loved that version of him. I set my mug down. "But people change, Chloe. Sometimes, when life gets really hard, people forget who they are supposed to be. They make terrible, cowardly choices because they are terrified. And the choice he made was a choice that hurt us very badly." I reached across the table and took both of her hands in mine. But that exact same choice is what forced us to end up here. In this cafe, living the beautiful life we have right now. The absolute darkest night of Mom's life ended up being the sunrise to our brightest morning. So no, I don't hate him anymore. Honestly, I just don't think about him at all. Chloe nodded slowly. She seemed to digest the answer, and it appeared to satisfy her. We went back to eating our cake in a comfortable, loving silence. But fate, it seems, possesses a very twisted sense of humor. As if the universe had been eavesdropping on our conversation, the brass bell above the front door jingled sharply, signaling that someone had walked in. I opened my mouth to shout that we were closed for the night. But as I lifted my head and looked toward the door, the words violently caught in my throat. Standing in the doorway was a man. He was gaunt, bordering on emaciated. The faded flannel shirt he wore hung loosely off his bony frame, at least 2 sizes too big. His hair was greasy, overgrown, and unkempt. His face was marked by a faint scar over his left eyebrow, and the massive purple bags under his eyes made him look at least a decade older than he actually was. He stood there hesitating, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot, as if he couldn't decide whether to step fully inside or turn and run. For 3 long seconds, I didn't even recognize him. But then, his eyes met mine. Eyes that used to sparkle with ambition and indie rock dreams were now cloudy, completely hollow, and drowning in absolute crushing despair. Ryan. Time seemed to physically stop. The ticking of the vintage wall clock behind the counter suddenly sounded like a snare drum. Chloe, who didn't remember his face clearly enough to place him, just stared at the strange, disheveled man with mild curiosity. Ryan didn't look at Chloe. It was as if he physically couldn't stomach it. His agonizing gaze remained locked entirely on me. Rachel. His voice was gravelly, rasping, barely above a whisper. I stood up slowly, deliberately positioning my body slightly in front of Chloe in a fierce, protective stance. I didn't feel an ounce of fear. All I felt was a vast, echoing emptiness. This man standing in front of me was a complete stranger, a pathetic, tragic stranger. He was merely a ghost from my past who had entirely lost his ability to haunt me. "What do you want?" I asked. My voice was perfectly flat, ice cold. "I heard your business blew up. You're super successful now," he stammered out, shivering slightly. I need a job, Rach. Anything. I'll wash dishes. I'll mop the floors. I'll take out the trash. I'll do whatever you want." He dropped his head, staring at the floor, totally unable to maintain eye contact. "I've tried everywhere else. Nobody will hire me. His plea was so unimaginably pathetic it bordered on the absurd. He hadn't trekked all the way here to beg for forgiveness. He hadn't come to see the beautiful daughter he threw away. He came here because he had hit absolute rock bottom, and he saw me as his literal last resort, not as a lost love, but as an ATM. A final lifeboat to pull him out of the gutter. I stepped out from behind the table and walked toward him, stopping a safe 6 feet away. "Listen to me, Ryan," I said. My voice was eerily quiet, yet carried the weight of an anvil. This kitchen, every single ceramic plate and glass in it, was bought with the tears you caused. Every chair and table in this room is a monument to the hundreds of sleepless nights I spent raising your child entirely by myself. Every single dollar of profit in my bank account is the result of the blood and sweat that you were too much of a coward to contribute. I stared dead into his eyes, which were now rapidly filling with desperate tears. "You have absolutely zero rights in this building. You have no right to my success. You have no right to a job here. And you forfeited your right to be called a father a long, long time ago." I pointed a firm finger at the door. "This establishment is called Chloe's Cafe, not the Second Chance Cafe. Get out." He looked utterly shattered. Maybe in his warped mind, he had expected me to scream, throw a coffee mug at him, or break down crying. But all he received was freezing, indifferent calmness, and absolute, unyielding rejection. He glanced over my shoulder at Chloe, just a fleeting, cowardly microsecond of a glance, and then turned around. He pushed the door open and shuffled out, disappearing instantly into the cold, dark city night. I felt absolutely nothing. No surge of triumphant joy, no lingering pity, just a final, heavy period at the end of a very long sentence. A chapter that had finally, permanently been slammed shut. A few weeks after that bizarre encounter, an old sorority sister from college, who had been living out on the West Coast, stopped by the cafe while visiting family. Over iced lattes, we caught up on years of missed life events. Suddenly, she leaned in and said, "Hey, Rach, do you have any idea what happened to Madison?" I shook my head. Her name barely even registered in my brain anymore. "I ran into her last month when I went back to our hometown," my friend whispered, her eyes wide. "Rach, I swear to God, I almost didn't recognize her. She's working the register at a discount dollar store out in the sticks. She looked so ragged. When I said hi, she looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her. We talked for a minute, and she just sounded so incredibly bitter. She blamed Ryan. She blamed her dad for the bankruptcy. She blamed the investors. She blamed the media. She blamed literally everyone on planet Earth except herself." My friend took a sip of her coffee, shaking her head. "She is just trapped in her own venom. The family money is totally gone, her looks are fading from the stress, and all her rich socialite friends dropped her like a bad habit. All she has left is regret and fury." It was honestly just depressing to look at. I listened to the story in total silence. So, that was how her fairy tale ended. Not behind actual prison bars, and not starving on the streets, but a punishment that was much more subtle and infinitely more cruel. Condemned to live forever inside a maximum security prison of hatred that she had constructed with her own 2 hands. She had gotten exactly the world she schemed for, and that world collapsed on top of her, leaving her with absolutely nothing, not even the basic ability to love herself. That night, after a long, fulfilling day of work, Chloe and I curled up on the couch in our beautiful home, flipping through old photo albums. I showed her pictures of me from my college days. Photos of me laughing hysterically with girls from my dorm. A photo of me holding a cheap plastic trophy when I won that campus cooking contest. A picture of me in my cap and gown, smiling with a heart full of naive hope. Look, Mom was actually pretty cute back then, huh? Chloe giggled, pointing at my questionable early 2000s fashion choices. I laughed. I was gorgeous. Thank you very much. I stared at the glossy photo of my younger self. A naive, overly trusting girl who had absolutely no clue just how brutally vicious the world was about to be to her. But looking at her, I didn't feel an ounce of sadness anymore. I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. That young girl went to war. She fell hard. She was betrayed, she bled, and she was broken into pieces. But she dragged herself back up, pieced herself back together, and stood up infinitely stronger, forged in titanium. I had finally forgiven, not Ryan, and certainly not Madison. I had forgiven the past for my own sanity. I had forgiven myself for ever being so blindingly naive. That forgiveness had set me completely free. My ultimate revenge was never about orchestrating their downfall. My ultimate revenge was my own radical, unapologetic happiness. A whole, beautiful life that I built with my own two bare hands, brick by brick. I hugged Chloe tightly, breathing in the sweet, strawberry scent of her shampoo. Outside our living room window, the night sky was clear, and the stars were beginning to burn brightly against the blackness. One star, in particular, seemed to shine far brighter than the rest. Years ago, I used to point at a star just like that, and lie to my daughter, telling her that was where her father lived. Today, I didn't have to lie anymore. I could simply press my hand against my own chest, right over my beating heart, and tell her, everything we will ever need is right here, sweetie. It's always been right here. And amidst the sound of our joyous laughter echoing through the warmth of our living room, I knew with absolute certainty that our story was never a tragedy about revenge. It was a masterpiece about resurrection. And our morning sun had only just begun to rise.